The Detroit Lions traveled to Minnesota this past weekend to take on the Vikings in what would be their first divisional matchup of the NFL season. And this game quickly became one of the best on the NFL's calendars, with turnovers, big plays, high stakes, and the first game of the NFL season that truly felt like a playoff performance. Both teams walked into this matchup with a ton to play for. With a victory on Sunday, the Minnesota Vikings would have taken a 2.5 game lead in the NFC North, held firm control of the number one seed in the NFC, as well as potentially being in the driver's seat for the rest of the season in the division. And with a victory on Sunday, the Detroit Lions would take control of that one seed. They would take control of the NFC North, take first place in both the conference and the division, and be really in the driver's seat themselves to take control and have control of their own destiny. In today's video, we're going to take a look at this matchup, break down what happened between the Vikings and the Lions, go over the takeaways, the standout players, and what this game means potentially for a Detroit Lions trade rumor. But with that being said, let's get right on into taking a look at this game. As the Detroit Lions, of course, left this game with a 31-29 victory. The slow start in Minnesota did not hold the Lions back, as their second quarter surge led them to score 21 points unanswered going into halftime with the lead. Of course, the slow start with a couple of three and outs. They didn't, in fact, get a first down until the second quarter of this football game. And we all know how the Detroit Lions started. A three and out, a fake punt that did not work, that set Minnesota up within the Detroit Lions' 40-yard line for their first drive of the game. They gave up a touchdown almost immediately. The drive after, they gave up a field goal. But going into the second quarter, a light switch flipped. Something changed. And the Detroit Lions were to score 21 points unanswered and went into halftime with an 11-point lead. The second half was back and forth. The Lions scored and the Vikings scored. The Lions scored and the Vikings scored. Every answer the Detroit Lions put up, the Minnesota Vikings had one in return. And if it was not to come down to a clutch field goal, the Vikings very well may have won this game. But coming down to the wire in a last-second game-winning field goal kick, first-year kicker Jake Bates with a 45-yard game-winning attempt sent it right through the uprights for the Detroit Lions to celebrate. Now, the Detroit Lions as a team this game, I thought were very, very good. As a passing attack, they went 22 for 25, 247 yards through the air, and 2 touchdowns. On the ground, they had 27 carries for 144 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. They did have 3 fumbles as an offense, one of them being lost in return for a touchdown by Ivan Pace. That, of course, does need to be cleaned up, but overall, I thought with the amount of pressure that the Detroit Lions were under, the amount of blitzing, and the amount of bodies around the line of scrimmage, they were able to run the ball very well. They were able to pass the ball very efficiently, and they were able to take advantage of an aggressive Minnesota defense. On the defensive side of the ball, I thought the Detroit Lions were quite good. Just 23 points allowed against a top 5 scoring offense in the Minnesota Vikings. In their first full contest without Aiden Hutchinson, they were able to get a couple of takeaways. They were able to get 4 sacks, able to get a couple TFLs. And overall, they were just very, very good. They were a great unit. And although very few players stood out as an individual, I thought the defense as a unit and as a group played very, very well. Again, holding that top tier Minnesota offense of Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and Aaron Jones and a great play caller in Kevin O'Connell to just 23 points on the road in a very, very dangerous environment is not an easy task. And I thought Aaron Glenn called a fantastic game. I thought every single player played their role to a T. And even though there were a couple of big plays, even though there were a couple miscommunications for touchdowns, I thought the Lions overall defensively played very, very strong. Couple of standout performers. Jared Goff had an 88% completion percentage, passed for 280 yards in the air with 2 passing touchdowns, one to Amon-Ra St. Brown and one to Khalif Raymond. Amon-Ra St. Brown had 8 targets, 8 receptions, 112 yards, and a touchdown through the air. He was so instrumental in yesterday's victory. He had so many big catches, so many big first downs, a lot of tough catches, and he was a big part in the Detroit Lions' victory and successes on Sunday. Jahmyr Gibbs, though, I think was the offensive player of the game. 15 carries for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground with 4 receptions and 44 yards through the air. He had 160 scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns, was a big spark in the Detroit Lions' second quarter surge. he was phenomenal. He was very good for the offense. He was really the engine that sparked and ignited the Detroit Lions comeback. Defensively, as I said, not many players really stood out as individuals. A lot of guys just played their roles very well and helped the defense to a victory. But Brian Branch seems to stand out every single week. With 4 tackles, 2 passes defended, and an interception to swing momentum, he was easily the defensive player of the game. He also had a fumble recovery that he did return for a touchdown that got called back due to the wide receiver stepping out of bounds prematurely. But I did want to mention that as he did get in the right position, was able to scoop and score. Unfortunately for him, it just did not fall his way. A couple of other honorable mentions. I thought Trevor Nowaske was very good. He has slid into that Sam linebacker role in replacement of Derek Barnes, and he's played very well. I thought had his best game as a professional, and I thought certainly had his best game as a Detroit Lion. The game-sealing sack on the final play of the game, shot through the gap, was able to get to Sam Darnold very quickly, and him as a pass rusher at the Sam linebacker position, he's generated quite a few pressures and finally got home for his first career sack. Josh Paschal has sacks in back-to-back weeks now after getting to Sam Darnold yesterday in the Minnesota contest. Josh Paschal, I think, has taken a massive step this season. His ability to collapse the pocket, the strength and explosiveness that he showed was huge in the Detroit Lions defensive effort. Again, he was able to get to Sam Darnold at least once and was able to put a couple other pressures on him as well. Drew a couple of holding penalties in the run game that backed Minnesota up, and I thought he was the most impressive player on the defensive line. I know a lot of people go back and forth and they don't like that Josh Paschal doesn't put up elite numbers, but that's never going to be his game. Josh Paschal is the dirty work guy. Josh Paschal is the player that is just going to continue to grind out double teams. He's going to continue to collapse the pocket, and it is up to the rest of the defense to clean up the mess and the chaos that Josh Paschal creates. And I say that in the best way possible. Josh Paschal is a good football player. And under Tyrell Williams, he's taken a massive step in his development. I thought he was excellent on Sunday. And I think for back-to-back weeks now, Josh Paschal has been arguably one of the best defensive linemen the Detroit Lions have. Malcolm Rodriguez played very well, was very great in the run game, had a couple of really good pass coverage snaps. I think covering in for a guy like Derek Barnes, of course, with them being a little limited there, I think he's been very, very good as well. He had a couple TFLs from what I remember, was very quick to get to the line of scrimmage, and was able to mitigate a lot of plays for very minimal yardage. Jack Campbell felt like he was everywhere. Jack Campbell felt like every single time Minnesota ran the ball, 46 was in the gap, 46 was in the backfield, and every single time it felt like he was in the right spot at the right time, making the right plays. And again, it wasn't flashy. He didn't force a fumble, didn't get an interception, didn't have some massive hit stick, but he was right there at the line of scrimmage. Even though I think he might have only finished with 6, 7 tackles, every single one of those tackles was right up to the line of scrimmage and was so impactful to shutting down the Minnesota run game. Khalif Raymond, the second touchdown receiver of the game, of course, is going to get a shout out. Khalif Raymond is an underrated player. He is a kick returner. He is a punt returner. He is the 7th, maybe the 8th option in the Detroit Lions offense. But yesterday, he was very big in the Detroit Lions offensive success. A couple of big plays, one deep shot that was missed and overthrown by Jared Goff, where Khalif Raymond had his man beat for a touchdown. Could have walked away with a lot more statistically, but did what he needed to do, got in the end zone once, ended up being a major player in that game, and was a very, very crucial to the Lions' success. Now, overall takeaways from this game, I thought the pass rush was just okay. I know they got to the quarterback 4 times. I know they had 4 tackles for loss and 4 sacks. A lot of it came from the interior pressure. A lot of it came from Aleem McNeil. A lot of it came from DJ Reader. A lot of it came from Josh Paschal collapsing the pocket. Very little of it came from the edge rush being fantastic, right? A lot of it was schemed, 3 linebacker sacks, and of course the one from Josh Paschal. A lot of it was schemed up. It was a great play design by Aaron Glenn. It was a great play call by Aaron Glenn, and a very, very well called game, I thought, by the defensive coordinator. But you look at the defensive line and you look at every individual performance, and Josh Paschal was good, right? Trevor Nowaske was solid, but there wasn't really an edge rusher that stood out, right? James Houston really had very little impact on the game. Isaac Ukwu, I thought, had a couple of pressures, but wasn't really standing out there either. They need an edge rusher, and I think this game really proved that they do need an edge rusher. I know that Minnesota has a good offensive line. I know Christian Darrisaw is very good. I know Brian O'Neill is very good. The interior was a little bit questionable, but still, their tackle duo is very strong. Very few edge rushers play good games against Minnesota for that exact reason, but I do think that they played okay. Taking a look at the kicking situation, the Detroit Lions have it figured out. Jake Bates is now 10 for 10 on field goals on the season and 20 for 21 on extra points. A player for the first year of his NFL career, coming from the XFL, kicking in some of the biggest moments of the Detroit Lions season so far, has turned into one of the best and most reliable kickers the Lions have had since Matt Prater. The offense, simply too much. 31 points. They put up 31 points on a top three scoring defense, despite the fact that Sam Laporta and Jamison Williams combined for 2 catches for 21 yards, despite the fact that they took 4 sacks as an offense, and despite the fact that David Montgomery, the usual engine to their offense, rushed for just 31 yards on 9 attempts. They still put up 31 points. They simply have too many playmakers to stop. They simply are too good and too efficient as an offense. And much like we said in the preview video, the Lions' offensive efficiency is the reason that they won this game. Minnesota's inability to sustain drives late in the game was a big reason as to why they couldn't ice the game on their last offensive possession. And it was a big reason as to why the Detroit Lions were able to get in field goal range and kick the game-winning field goal. Now, potential trade partners. I think it's pretty obvious that the Detroit Lions needed to make a trade. Their edge rush was not very good, and I know that Minnesota has a great tackle duo in Brian O'Neill and Christian Darrisaw. I know that they have a very strong overall offensive line. The edge rushers did not get it done. Josh Pascal was good. He's probably a high-end 2 at the best for an edge rusher, and I think that's really what the Detroit Lions need him to be. But that also means the Detroit Lions can't afford for the other player on the other side of Josh Pascal to be a defensive tackle or to be a low-end edge rusher 3 like James Houston or Isaac Ugu seem to be. They need at least another edge rusher 2 in that group and in that dynamic. And I think the best, most likely trade partners are as follows. The Patriots, they are 1-6, and I think Josh Uche is probably a player that could be on the trade block. I would prefer Keon White, but considering the fact that Keon White is a second-year player who's having a breakout year, I find it very hard to believe that they would let him go for very cheap, if at all. He's probably not on the trade block and really isn't a very realistic option. But Josh Uche is, and I think the 1-6 Patriots could be willing to move on from a more veteran pass rusher. The Lions could potentially spend a day 3 pick on him, adding him to the defensive line rotation. The Browns, they're 1-6. They just lost their starting quarterback for the year due to an Achilles tear, and they're not going to win very many games. Come the trade deadline, they very well may be 1-8, and Zadarius Smith could be on the move. An older player, 31 years old, not necessarily in his physical prime anymore, but still already has 5 sacks on the season. Is he going to come in and be the Aiden Hutchinson replacement? Probably not, but if he can come in and finish the season with 10, 11 sacks for the Detroit Lions, trade him for a 5th, a 6th-round selection for the veteran pass rusher, that would give the Detroit Lions, again, another high-end number 2 pass rusher, a player that could potentially come in and be good for what the Detroit Lions need him to be. And again, he'll be very cheap. He won't be anything more than a day 3 pick for a struggling Browns franchise, and I think that makes a lot of sense for the Detroit Lions. The Tennessee Titans, the team that the Detroit Lions take on next weekend, are 1-5. I believe that they haven't won a game since their second week of the NFL season, and they're very much struggling. Harold Landry is having a good season. Harold Landry, I believe, has 4 sacks on the year. He'd be a bit pricier. He has a big contract going on. He'd probably cost about a 2nd-round pick. Maybe you get Landry and a day 3 pick in return. But I think that this one is a bigger swing, but I think it's also less of a risk. Harold Landry has worked side by side with Detroit Lions defensive line coach Terrell Williams for the better part of 3 seasons. They have been together. They have seen a lot of success. We've seen multiple 10-plus sack seasons from Harold Landry when working under Terrell Williams. He knows exactly how to get the best out of Landry. He is a player that, would be expensive, would probably cost a 2nd-round selection, but would be more closely aligned to that edge rusher 1 that they need, right? More closely aligned to an Aiden Hutchinson replacement as opposed to a temporary Band-Aid. And of course, when Aiden Hutchinson does return to this team, Harold Landry would be a top tier number two edge rusher, and pairing those two would be very, very good for the Lions. His contract expires after 2025, so we'd be here for 2 years, about a year and a half. Pair him with Hutchinson, potentially go win a Super Bowl with a great pass rush, and then you can move on from him and extend Aiden Hutchinson to a massive contract to replace the one you're missing out on with Landry leaving. The last realistic thing I think the Lions could potentially go for is Carl Granderson, a player from the Saints. Saints are 2-5. They are 0-5 in their last 5 contests. They are not very good. They're on a backup quarterback. Their wide receiver 2 is done for several weeks. Their wide receiver 1 missed last week and might miss this week. They are very much struggling. They have potentially been rumored to be trading Alvin Kamara. They are struggling, as many of us know. But Carl Granderson has 3 sacks on the season. He is, again, a bit closer to that Josh Uche, Zadarius Smith, high-end edge rusher 2, as opposed to a true edge rusher 1. But pairing 2 pretty good edge rusher 2s next to each other with an elite defensive tackle duo, I think would still help the Lions. I think it would still give the Lions a little bit extra juice on the pass rush. And I think that the Lions could potentially look to make a move like this. A player that won't cost them anything more than a day 3 selection, a player that might not be around for more than a year or two, but a player that can kind of fill the void right now, kind of be a bandage, be an upgraded edge rusher 2 for next season. And then, in the draft with your first round pick, go get an edge rusher, go get a pass rusher, go get a defensive lineman or 2, and replace those guys through the draft to continue to build the roster and build the franchise in the way that you've done so in years past. I think that is the best case scenario and the path that they should take, but of course, that is up for debate. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about the Detroit Lions situation, how you feel about the pass rush and the entire game from the Minnesota perspective, as well as what you think the Lions should do on the trade block. I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say. With that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.